Hello and welcome to our training on assessment activities in care, where we're going to apply some principles of assessment specific to the care process. So let's take a look at what we will cover in this training. So there are three general sections in this training. The first, just talking about an overview of assessments in care, their purpose, and linking that to eligibility and expectations of court. And then we'll move into the types of assessment and investigation, which are parts of the care process in which an assessment is required, focusing in on the petition, the county report, and a clinical evaluation. And then we'll talk about practical considerations and next steps with assessment activities. So our learning objectives for today is that by the end of the session, you will have an increased ability to identify those various points within the care process in which an assessment activity should occur, talk about the different staff that can complete various assessment activities, and then talk about some recommended content to be included in those assessment activities specifically related to care, and then describe some practical approaches for completing assessments in care. We will hear from Rachel Johnson Yates and Laura Collins at HMA. Rachel is a licensed mental health and addiction counselor. She also does quite a bit of work with public speaking and educating and developing innovative programs that focus on mental and behavioral health. Laura Collins is a managing principal with Health Management Associates. She's a licensed clinical social worker with 25 years of experience in psychiatry and across the behavioral health continuum. So now we'll be turning to a live discussion that Rachel and Laura hosted to talk about assessments in care.
Thanks, Patricia. All right, so let's go ahead and move to the next slide, and we're going to just kick it off talking about our case example, James. And so we always like to provide a case example, and of course our case examples are hypothetical, but they are designed to be representative of a relatively common or typical sort of case that we see within the care realm. And so here we have James. James is a 51-year-old Army veteran who's been known to County Behavioral Health for several years. And despite him having some interactions with County Behavioral Health, he's actually never undergone a formal clinical evaluation. While he has had intermittent contact, he's never really been consistently engaged. He was dishonorably discharged from the Army due to physical altercations that were occurring as a result of his mental health concerns. He's been staying in shelters and living on the streets, occasionally connecting with veteran services, but really, really struggling to follow through with services, which has resulted in a lack of stability for James. James is a person who is really, really artistic and very talented, especially in the realm of music. He loves playing music, and that's one of his primary outlets. Recently, James has had several episodes of wandering into traffic, shouting. Witnesses who reported these incidents noted that he seemed to be really disoriented. They were worried that he was being aggressive and that he may be experiencing some hallucinations. And because James is having these continued episodes of appearing disorganized, having paranoia, really, and we were feeling really concerned about his ability to care for himself, James's mother actually went to the self-help center and filed a petition with the court in hopes of getting James connected with care services. So let's keep James at front of mind as we're going through the session today and really think about how we might be able to apply the concepts that we're discussing to his particular situation. All right, with that, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so as you know, the title of this session is in regards to assessment in care. Those of us, which was probably most of us, who are familiar with the behavioral health realm, use the term assessment a lot. And it's really, really important that as we start on this journey today, that we clearly differentiate the difference between the term clinical assessment that we use on pretty much a daily basis in the behavioral health realm and what we mean in regards to assessment activities in the care process. And so when we talk about clinical assessments, we're really focused on things like gathering history, and that history includes things like mental health, comorbid conditions, substance use disorder, social history, and this history does things like informing diagnoses, treatment needs, and helps contribute to treatment planning. It's conducted by behavioral health professionals. We typically use various tools, behavioral and functional assessments. We'll often get collateral information and look into a person's medical, behavioral health records and history to help inform the clinical assessment. And it really also helps to define that person's capacity in terms of how they're functioning, needs, goals and preferences, and best approaches for intervention. And so that's what we mean when we talk about a clinical behavioral health assessment. Now, when we talk about assessment activities in care, we're actually talking about some areas that definitely have overlap but are distinct. And so what we know is that the assessment activities in care, some of them, as we'll learn later, do include components of a clinical assessment. However, one of the primary purpose of these assessment activities in care is to help inform the legal process around care itself. And so this includes things like how the individual meets or does not meet eligibility criteria for care. And it will include things like diagnosis, how they're doing in terms of their safety and their current functioning. The assessment activities in care will also talk about what were the outcomes of attempts to voluntarily engage the person early in the process when we're doing things like the investigative report. It will also be assessment of capacity to provide informed consent regarding things like psychotropic medications, which happens later in the process during the clinical evaluation. And so we really wanted to take some time to be clear about this up front, that the assessment activities that we'll be talking about today will have some overlap in terms of traditional clinical assessments, but there'll also be areas of differentiation. And really the big thing and the big takeaway here is that assessment activities in care are really oriented to help inform the legal process. That is what the care realm is all about. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to start with the purpose of the care assessment activities. And what we know is that they have many, many, many purposes. So first and foremost, we're really making recommendations around whether or not we feel that the person is eligible for care. And we are also doing work and taking steps to make sure that we are collecting other sorts of care-specific information to help inform the care proceedings. And there are other points where the assessment has to gather specific information in the care process around points in the process where we'll be looking at things like voluntary engagement, capacity to provide informed consent, etc. We're also evaluating historical information regarding the participants' diagnoses, treatment history, and needs, and we'll talk more about how we can incorporate that into the assessment activities in order to be as trauma-informed as possible in terms of how we're going about these activities. We want to use the assessment activities to identify potential supports for the person. Again, a primary goal of the care process is that we're helping improve the functioning and stability of the person that we're serving. And a big part of that is making sure that we identify as many supports for the participant as possible. We also want to use the assessment activities to identify and document the participants' goals and preferences. And so, as we've talked about many times in the care realm, prioritizing the participants' preferences is really of the utmost importance because we want to make sure that treatment processes, support processes, community engagement, supportive services, all of these sorts of wraparound services that we're going to be offering the participant are options that the participant is likely to engage with and that truly will be helpful in terms of improving the stability for that individual. We also want to use the assessment activities to help identify potentially beneficial treatments and supports, including medication. And so during the assessment activities, we're going to be doing things like looking at past treatment episodes, talking with the person about what has worked for them, what hasn't worked for them, talking with them about which medications have been effective, which ones perhaps are not preferable to them, and really taking that time to get to know the individual, their history and experience with treatment, and doing all we can to help align those things to make sure that that person has the greatest possible chance of stabilizing through their involvement with the care process. Next slide, please. Another part of the assessment activities that's really, really important is that through these assessment activities, we at multiple times are revisiting the eligibility criteria to make sure that throughout the care process that this person is meeting eligibility to participate in care. And so, of course, as we've talked about eligibility in other trainings, and we know that the person has to have a diagnosis of schizophrenia spectrum or other eligible psychotic disorders. And then also, diagnosis alone is not enough for a person to be eligible for care. And so when we're working with a person, of course, we start with this diagnosis, and then we also have to assess for these other sorts of symptoms, behaviors, and needs that are part of the eligibility criteria for a person that's participating in care. And so we have to make sure and assess to demonstrate that the person's symptoms are severe enough and persistent enough that they are significantly interfering with the person's daily functioning. We want to make sure that if they're engaged in voluntary outpatient treatment, that at this point, that level of care is not enough to help provide them with what they need to be able to be stabilized. We are documenting that these individuals are unlikely to be able to survive safely in the community without involving this level of supervision, and that their condition is substantially deteriorating over time, and that we're worried that without intervention, that their condition will return to a previous crisis level or really significant level of need, or that it will continue to deteriorate in that direction. And then we also want to assess so that we're able to accurately document that we in terms of our clinical judgment, believe that this person will be likely to benefit from participation with a care agreement or plan, and that this is the least restrictive alternative for that individual. And so the assessment activities that we're going to describe today will continually inform whether or not that person meets CARE Act eligibility. And it's really important that we are visiting this throughout that person's journey to make sure that, as is noted in the last bullet here, that their participation in care truly is the most likely to be able to benefit them and is the least restrictive alternative for them in terms of the options that they have to help increase their functioning. Next slide, please. And then in terms of expectations for how to use the assessment activities in courts, this is really, really, really important. Our respondents will hear assessment details in court, and they will receive related documents that have to do with their documentation around their diagnosis, their functioning, observations, things that were documented throughout these assessment activities. And so it's really, really important that we are conscious to make advanced preparation to help them emotionally prepare and psychologically prepare for hearing and reading these materials. For individuals that are receiving these individuals or are receiving this information or hearing this information for the first time without intentional preparation, that can be an incredibly distressing, stressful experience. It can just totally destroy rapport and trust with the team that is engaging in the assessment activities. And so we want to make sure that we're really helping prep that person for what the assessment activities mean, how they're going to be used, and what sorts of information is going to be reported to the court. And when we talk about being trauma-informed, this is a real opportunity to make sure that we are connecting with trauma-informed practice in a way that's really intentional. And so some ways that you can be trauma-informed in helping prepare that person for the court process is spending some time deciding and thinking about how and when we're going to share assessment information, while of course prioritizing the safety of that individual. And so thinking about, day of court right before they walk into the courtroom for a lot of people is not going to be the right time to show that person for the first time the content that has been presented to the court. And most often they will have already gotten that packet at the time of being served notice. So you want to make sure that we're being really intentional to have a time and space that is quiet and set aside to go over together what's going in that court report. We want to make sure that we're framing the assessment activities in a way that emphasizes that we're using the assessment to help make sure that that person is getting the services and supports that they need to help promote their overall well-being. And so we can say things like, there's going to be some things in here that may be a little bit difficult to read. It's always hard to read about areas where we're maybe not doing as well as we hope we are. But I have to document these items in order to convince the judge that you need all of these supports that we're going to be able to get you to help you get back up on your feet. And so really helping them understand why it is that we're documenting the things that we're documenting, why we're documenting instances of things that may feel embarrassing or shame oriented for that person. It's really important that we use our behavioral health skills to help frame those up in a way that the person can understand the purpose. And also being really mindful of the language that we're putting in court reports, and remembering that they're going to hear and or read everything that's in there. And so being thoughtful that, of course, we have to document to a level that demonstrates to the court that this person is eligible, that they are having all of these struggles in functioning, that they are having incidents that are causing us concern, but doing so in a way that continues to maintain respect, that is trauma informed, that remember that is person centered and is very focused on the future and the potential benefits that that person may get from participating in the court process. And so really being thoughtful about, with every step of all of these assessment activities, that there is a level of transparency here that can be very difficult for the people we're serving. We want to make sure as teams and as individuals that we're putting a lot of thought into how these things are documented. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to ask my colleague Laura. Laura, so given what we've talked about so far in today's session, from your perspective, what sorts of things should a behavioral health professional make sure to take into consideration as we are thinking about James and we're thinking about his first assessment point in care?
Thanks, Rachel, and hi, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. Um, you know, I think the one thing, I mean, you've made already so many great points, Rachel, but the one thing that comes to mind is, individuals like James, probably have undergone many assessments throughout his life. So you want to keep that in mind, and that, the experience of being assessed can be stressful when you're, especially if you're not in a stable place with your mental health at the time, and being asked personal questions about his life or use of substances, his family, his treatment history. So kind of like what you were highlighting, Rachel, in terms of that trauma-informed approach, is just kind of thinking about not just even the first point of assessment with him, but the fact that, there's multiple points potentially of assessment throughout care. And really thinking about, and I'm kind of reiterating some of your points, just letting him know about the purpose of the questions that we're asking, and who we're sharing that information with, and really being thoughtful about not duplicating questions that you may already have the answers to, and again, that he may have been asked many times already. And then, of course, always prioritizing James' needs and choices, during that conversation, during that assessment process, and using that assessment, again, as a way to build rapport and engagement, and making sure that James knows who else his supports are. Could be, other people on the team, the volunteer supporter, if James has one, a peer support specialist, maybe a family member. So just thinking about those things as you're working through those assessment points with James.
That's great. Thank you, Laura. Yeah, and I think it's really important to everything you said just really highlights that the purpose of all of the assessment activities is to promote help and support for James. And so having him be the center of the motivation of the reason why we're doing all of this, keeping that front and center of our minds is so important. So thank you. All right, I'll kick it over to you.
Wonderful. Great. Well, let's do a little deeper dive into going to the next slide and talk about the different types of assessment activities that are taking place in the care process. So if we jump to the next slide, we're on this slide, we're really highlighting again those different points of assessment throughout the care process. Rachel and I will try to pull in James' case as an example, but really each point of these assessments play a critical role in both gathering information that informs the court's decisions and really ensuring that our interventions are appropriate. So the highlighted assessment points are the petition, the county investigative report, and the clinical evaluation. So as we go through each of these, I'm going to try to briefly emphasize the who, the what, and the how. So who's conducting it, what information is required at that stage, how this information is used to support that care process. So again, we'll pull in James, to illustrate some of this and how that, this might guide some next steps for his treatment and support. But let's just start with the petition. So the petition is prepared by the petitioner. In this case, in James's case, it was filed by a family member. However, if the county behavioral health team had filed the petition, it would include a declaration from the county that supports the petition with additional clinical information. So in terms of the what, the petition really needs to contain facts that support that James meets or may meet the eligibility criteria that we heard about earlier. And the how, so it's presented to the court for prima facie review. And if it meets or may meet eligibility, the court may request the county investigative report that we'll talk about, another form of the assessment. And prima facie really refers to at first sight or at first impression that the individual may meet those eligibility criteria. So again, in James's case, since a family member completed the petition, the county BH team would be responsible for sharing a copy of the petition to him when serving the notice and when they're beginning to conduct that investigation. So let's move to that. So the county report is really the assessment that's prepared by the county BH agency after that prima facie showing has been met. And really, the county report is typically ordered only if the petitioner wasn't the county. In this case, they weren't. It was the family. So the report includes in terms of the what, the report includes an assessment of eligibility, the outcome of the team's efforts to engage the individual, and an assessment of the individual's ability to engage with this person voluntarily outside of care. And then how it's used, if the court determines that the report supports eligibility, the court then sets the petition for that initial hearing and hearing on the merits. And we will have some slides where we go into a deeper dive on these items as well. For a case example with the county report, since James' mother is filing the petition, it will be required that the county complete that investigative report. So also quickly just moving to the clinical evaluation in the care process, which really would only be required if a care plan versus agreement is being pursued. And we'll touch on that more in a minute as well. So this is being prepared by a licensed behavioral health professional on the team. Again, after that, the court determines that a care agreement isn't likely. And it's really, this clinical evaluation is really used to help inform the development of the care plan. And it digs deeper into the needs of the individual, their clinical presentation, including their history. And it really needs to address, in terms of the what, diagnosis. There is a component, legal capacity or decisional capacity to give informed consent for medications, for stabilizing medications, and then other helpful information, including the recommended supports. And it's really, how it's used. It's considered at the clinical evaluation hearing under the same standard or threshold that we just that the county report is held at, in terms of clear and convincing, that standard. Case example, so James is evaluated. The judge determines that James meets eligibility and orders the parties to work together on a care plan. So that's how we would kind of apply that. Again, we'll do a deeper dive in a minute. So we're about to just jump into the care process flow visual, and then we'll go into a little more detail. But again, kind of like what Rachel was talking about, if you notice, really all these at all these assessment points, there is an evaluation of eligibility. So it is really good to kind of make sure you're aware of what really is eligibility, what does that include, and what does it not necessarily include. So let's go to the next slide. And this is really just a visual of where we are in the flow. So you just see the little visual of the petition there. And really, this is that first point at which an assessment can occur. We have talked about referrals to care as well. And really, the entities that are making referrals, there's an assessment process there as well. But let's focus on the filing of the petition. So in James' case, his family filed. And one of the options when the family files the petition is to support that petition with a mental health declaration that the behavioral health provider could include. And we have actual resources on trainings on the mental health declaration in terms of the resources for petitioners webpage. So if the county is filing the petition themselves, again, they would need to also include that assessment or mental health declaration, which could be incorporated. Yes, they would include that mental health declaration at that time. So again, there's that visual. Let's move on to the next slide, to the petition. So petition really needs to include facts that support that the individual either meets or may meet eligibility, as you keep hearing. And then again, if County BH was completing that petition, they would again need to assess that person's eligibility and the facts to support this. So the facts that would be considered are their diagnoses, their observed behaviors or symptoms. Again, Rachel's touched on this in terms of eligibility, but just their mental, physical state, meeting basic needs, self-care, issues with maintaining a residence, transportation, managing funds, and relationships, community involvement, and declining to engage in treatment, or the treatment isn't helping in stabilizing their symptoms. So again, the petitioner should either include a mental health declaration by a licensed behavioral health professional, or provide evidence or attest to the individual's hospitalization. So this is, I don't know if we touched on this yet, but that would be specifically 250. So those are 14-day holds, one of which was in the last 60 days. The other point I want to make with that information is that the information around a 5250 can bolster that petition, but it's not technically listed in eligibility criteria. And there is often confusion around that that's actually a criteria for eligibility. So wanted to call that out. And in James's case, his mother's the petitioner. So she isn't required to do a formal assessment, but she could ask the behavioral health provider to complete the declaration and attest that they believe that James is eligible for care, just to support the petition. And then again, if County BH did decide to file, they would seek to really assess his eligibility with that supporting documentation in the form of that declaration that's submitted to the court. So a lot of information. Let's go to the next slide and go to the county investigative report. This is just that visual. And that second point in the care process, when, again, the assessment could be, again, required to support that legal process. And going to the next slide, there we saw the visual of where that county report exists. So again, if the county behavioral health agency isn't the petitioner, the court orders the county to complete that investigative assessment and report. Also, a lot of you know that this is also known as the Care 105 form that the court issues when they're asking for that investigative report. And that report or that form asks for a few things. It asks for determination of eligibility. It asks for what are the outcomes of the team's efforts in engaging the individual voluntarily. And it also asks for their conclusions and overall recommendations about the individual's voluntary engagement. So if the petitioner was the county behavioral health agency, the courts may request more information still. And they may use, and we're hearing about this, they may use that Care 105 form to request similar information that's noted here. Or the court could just request other information that would help make a determination on eligibility. So we are hearing from counties that sometimes even if the county team, BH team is the petitioner, that sometimes they're still receiving those 105 forms requesting either similar information or additional information. And again, let's circling back to James. So in James' case, again, it would be the county that would be assessing and doing that investigative report. So the next slide is really a nice visual that provides an overview of the two scenarios related to the issuing of a Care 105 form that I just mentioned. And it's, again, how the court will order county BH to produce that investigative report. So just kind of looking at that snapshot, again, restating it, when the county isn't the petitioner, the team will need to provide a more comprehensive response about eligibility, engagement, supporting documentation. And, again, keeping in mind that proof of prior psych hospitalizations, those 5250s, isn't an eligibility requirement, but if there is information that can help with the report. And then also current enrollment in services doesn't exclude, this is another reminder, doesn't exclude someone from eligibility for care. So someone can be enrolled in services, but they may not be engaged or stabilized in those services. So they would still potentially be eligible. So again, on the right, if the county is the petitioner, really the process typically moves just directly to the initial hearing and the hearing on the merits. But we are hearing that county BH teams are being asked sometimes for additional information, and that might be via the 105 form. So let's go to the clinical evaluation. Go to the next slide. And this is the next type of assessment and care. So the clinical evaluation happens really after it's determined that the parties could not come to a care agreement. So there just wasn't agreement on all those elements of what would go into the individual's care agreement or treatment plan. So then the clinical evaluation can inform the elements of the care plan. And if we go to the next slide, and just recapping, the clinical evaluation is really only ordered, again, if the agreement is unlikely, care agreement is unlikely. And there's a couple other bullets here about there isn't an existing clinical evaluation that was conducted recently, and the parties didn't stipulate to the use of a recent existing evaluation. So those are kind of the points to be made when you get to this stage in the process. And really, because of all the detailed clinical information and recommendations that are made at this point, it really does, the clinical evaluation does need to be completed by a licensed behavioral health professional. And this evaluation needs to include a diagnosis, clinical diagnosis. There is a point in here where there needs to be an evaluation as to capacity, decisional capacity to give informed consent regarding stabilizing medications or psychotropic medications, and other information that may be ordered by the court or that the evaluator believes might help the court make an informed decision about the appropriate care and services for the person. And it should also include an analysis of the recommended services, the recommended programs, housing, again, medications, and any other interventions that could support that individual's recovery and stability. All right. And let's go to the next slide and just briefly, just touch on that piece of the clinical evaluation that speaks to capacity and informed consent for medications, because that really is another assessment activity that takes place within the clinical evaluation. So again, the team does need to identify someone to assess for decisional capacity related to the individual's ability to provide informed consent for medications. And typically, it does need to be a licensed BH professional, but typically this would be a prescriber, so a psychiatrist or a psychiatric nurse practitioner. And really, in short, I'm just going to jump to the chase. Really, this assessment evaluates for whether the individual has the cognitive or mental ability to understand the information, including risks and benefits, information provided to them, and make a reasoned decision. So it typically involves making sure the individual is aware of their condition, their mental condition, aware of the recommendations and the recommended treatment. Again, understanding the risks and benefits and alternatives to the proposed treatment. And then can evaluate the information provided and participate in the treatment decision by means of a rational thought process. And then can express their decision about the treatment. We actually have a great training on this very topic. And on this slide, we also, speak to the other kind of the why behind what's the purpose of the court order. It does support the physicians, psychiatrists, the prescriber's ability to prescribe a psychotropic medication if the individual isn't able to give informed consent. So that's the other piece, the other why behind how this can be helpful in terms of supporting someone's stabilization. And let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to ask, we're now at our ideas in action. I'm going to ask Rachel a question. So we've quickly, Rachel, we've covered the different points in the care process where assessments are taking place. So really just turning to you, how do you see that these different assessment points helping, again, both with determining eligibility and guiding those appropriate interventions, and especially for individuals like James?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I think what's really cool about the different assessment points in the care process is that we are regularly touching base with the person served to make sure that the path that we're moving on is the most likely to be effective for them. And so with each of the assessment points, first, at the very beginning during the petitioning the process and the county report, we're identifying eligibility early, and we are as quickly as possible when that person is referred to care, determining whether or not that they are eligible, and if they're eligible, we are helping move them along the process to get them connected with services as quickly as possible. And if they're not, we're trying to get them connected with alternative services that might be able to help them. And I think that quick determination of eligibility is really great, because it's not these kind of very long wait lists, et cetera. It's something where we're really working to get that person in the doors as quickly as possible, and or connected with alternative services if they aren't eligible. Also, I think with each of these assessment activities that we're discussing, we are really working to make sure that we are developing a well-rounded and comprehensive understanding of the person that we're working with, and in effort to make sure that the interventions that we are working toward and that we are helping put in place for and with that person are the most likely to be effective. And so you can't really create an effective treatment or service plan without a really well-rounded understanding of what is happening currently with the individual, and then also what's been happening with them historically, because oftentimes history repeats itself in terms of human behavior. And so if we can understand the journey, the struggles, the triggers, the supports that person has had historically, it really helps set us up for future success in terms of how we are structuring how we move forward in terms of care. So I think I really appreciate how intentionally these assessment points are structured, and how, when we're talking with the different counties, how, more importantly than how they're structured, how intentionally the behavioral health teams in the counties are going about utilizing each of these assessment activities to really, really make sure we are doing a good job of serving the people that are involved in the care process. Cool. And with that, we can jump over to the next section. Okay, so we're going to take a few minutes now and talk about just some practical considerations and next steps in terms of assessment activities. So if you don't mind going to the next slide. So there's a lot of, despite the structure of the care process, there's actually a lot of opportunity to be flexible and creative in terms of how it is that we are approaching the assessment activities in care. What we know is, when we are working in the behavioral health realm, we are human beings working with other human beings, and things oftentimes don't go as planned. They can get messy. Our schedule gets disrupted. All sorts of things happen, right? And we're working with people who are managing some really significant mental health and sometimes substance use disorder needs. And so when we are working with a population that has a lot going on, it's really important that we are as flexible as possible, because again, our intention is to help and to support these individuals. And so the way that we go about these assessment activities is incredibly important. And so one of the first things to consider is that it is totally okay, and it is actually recommended, that we take a relatively unstructured approach to the assessment activities when it is possible. And so we have folks that we're working with that, as Laura mentioned and put really well, who have had oftentimes multiple assessments in their life, assessments that have been traumatizing, that have felt intrusive, and that oftentimes have not resulted in help that was enough to get them stabilized, despite the best efforts of the people completing these assessments. And so we're working with individuals that may have some skepticism around the assessment activities, may not trust us. And so if we can be thoughtful about how we're approaching the assessment, to do things like pulling from past charts, collaborating with other providers, doing anything that we can to help avoid duplication of effort, That is a really wonderful way to approach these assessments so that we can kind of drill down to the things that are most important rather than forcing a person to sit with us and repeat themselves. And if this is a person that's experienced a lot of crisis recently, it might be the third, fourth assessment that they've had in the last couple months. And so if there's a way that we can pull from other collateral content or contacts, that really, really is recommended. Also, we want to make sure that we are being as flexible as we can in terms of working with the court timelines and the participant needs. And so we, of course, want to use the core clinical and legal criteria as our foundation, but we can work with our team members to modify their approach based on how the person is or is not engaging, what's going on with their current mental state, their own individual needs. And you can actually use court continuances in a manner that is strategic to allow some time for engagement, rapport building, etc., rather than kind of trying to force the person to engage in a full assessment to determine eligibility as quickly as possible when we're seeing and sensing, and we all have been doing this work for a long time, and you can tell when, if you're pushing too hard, you're damaging rapport and decreasing the likelihood that the person is going to engage. If you can use things like court continuances strategically, sometimes that can really help increase the likelihood that that person is going to engage in the services that we're trying to get them connected with. We also want to make sure that we are coordinating between the legal and clinical teams early, and that we're making sure that the communication between these teams is happening very regularly, and that we have all the appropriate parties at the table, so that we can help do things like align expectations, make sure that the communication that we're having with the participant and with the court is aligned, and that we make sure that we're doing things that help expedite processes and prevent delays in terms of getting that person access to the care that they need. We also want to be thoughtful about being creative and using a multidisciplinary approach in terms of how we're approaching assessment activities, and being thoughtful about what sorts of different team members we might be able to incorporate. And so as we're doing some of these different assessment activities, as is appropriate according to who is required to do each step, we can do things like involve peer specialists, volunteer supporters, to help us facilitate the engagement, build rapport, build trust, bridge gaps in communication, help the person hopefully feel a little bit more open to some of the court processes or assessment activities. Counties have reported that doing assessment activities in pairs can sometimes be helpful, with maybe the clinician might take the lead, and maybe the peer or the volunteer supporters there to help reiterate or clarify for the participant, and or just help the participant feel like they for sure have somebody they know and that they trust at their side as they're going through this process. You can also do things like be flexible in terms of where you are facilitating the assessment. And so you can do the assessment, of course, being mindful of confidentiality, where the client is. It could be in their home, it could be in a shelter, it could be in a veteran center, it could be out in the community. We want that person to feel safe. And so we don't necessarily have to be totally sterile and have that person arrive at our office at a specific time to get this assessment complete. And then we want to make sure that the forms that we're using document care requirements, of course, but also making sure that we are capturing strengths, preferences, and information about co-occurring issues the person might be experiencing, which might include things like medical issues, substance use, etc. While the petition itself, of course, is standardized, counties actually have some flexibility in terms of how they design the other assessment forms and processes to fit the needs of the counties and the populations that you're seeing in your community. And that is a really great opportunity to get with your team and really think through where are we pulling from, where do we have collateral information, and where we're going with that. Next slide, please. And then for each assessment point, some practical considerations. We want to make sure that we're responding as quickly as possible when the person is hospitalized or incarcerated. And again, leveraging that collateral information, so we're not asking them to repeat information they've already given, especially information they've given recently. Within the court report, again, it's totally fine to take an unstructured assessment approach and be thoughtful in terms of how we're approaching gathering that information. As an example, if a person is really, really struggling and has a high acuity of symptoms that's making it feel very difficult or impossible for them to complete the formal sit-down session to get that information, that in and of itself is enough, sometimes may be enough evidence to demonstrate eligibility. And then with clinical evaluation, we want to make sure that we're maintaining trust and emphasizing autonomy and choice. And sometimes we recommend using a different person to complete the clinical evaluation that goes to the court than the primary care team member, so that we can be thoughtful about making sure that there is a trusted clinician that person has rapport with, that is less connected or more connected with the court process. Next slide, please. We also want to make sure that we're meeting individuals where they are and using a trauma-informed approach in terms of how we're approaching assessment activities. We can actually use these activities skillfully, that rather than using it as a checkbox, we can use it as a way to build rapport and really get to know that person. We want to make sure that we're giving information, but we're doing so in a way that's simple and easy to understand, that we repeat explanations and make sure that that person understands what it is that we're trying to communicate to them. We may use things like visual aids to help them understand the court process and the purpose of the assessment points that we're using. We, of course, want to use supported decision-making, and we have a training that we can offer around supported decision-making that's linked on the slide, and that every step along the way, we are making sure that we're being respectful and trauma-informed. Next slide, please. Just want to drop a plug here for our training around effective outreach and engagement strategies. Linked here on the slide. This training is really great. It helps highlight effective outreach and engagement strategies, talks about cultural humility, which is hugely important, as well as harm reduction, and lessons learned from our care implementation so far. Next slide. Okay, and then we also want to drop a note to remind everyone that you can absolutely be claiming for time spent performing care assessment activities. This includes ancillary time for prep, for internal meetings, oversight by supervisors and managers, outreach and engagement, court reports, etc. We have full training and some more information linked at the bottom of the slide here. Make sure you're claiming for this. Engaging folks in the care process takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and it's really helpful if your county can be reimbursed for all that time spent trying to make sure that this operates smoothly. All right, next slide. All right, Laura, back to you for our ideas in action. So if you're working with James to prepare him for the initial appearance, where the county investigative report is going to be discussed, what would you do to help him prepare for that event?
And we've definitely got a trauma-informed theme going today, Rachel, which is great. And I think I'm being a little repetitive, but that's okay. And you can see the bullets here in terms of, as we're preparing James for the hearing. And just the importance of transparency and being just very clear in terms of what James could expect, the purpose of the hearing, just answering questions, making sure that you're also asking James about his priorities, his preferences, and for that day, and just in general in terms of what he hopes the outcome to be. And also being transparent about what's going to be in the report. James is going to see what's in the report and how it's being used. And then always being thoughtful about identifying supports and helping James identify his supports, including that volunteer supporter role that is written into CARE Act, that there is a role for someone to be identified by the respondent to provide support to James and use sort of the skills of supported decision making, again, which we have trained on as well as the volunteer supporter role. So just an important reminder to, let the respondent or James tap in to that potential resource if there is one that's identified by him. And I think on that note, I will pass it to Patricia to close us out.
So again, the goal of this training is that by the end of the session, you would have an increased ability to apply these principles in assessments and care. So identify the points in the care process where assessment occurs, understand who can complete those assessments, list some recommended content that would be included in those assessments for care, and then describe some practical approaches for completing those assessment activities. So we have some next steps for you. We wanted to make sure you're aware of the resources on the CARE Act Resource Center. So we have both a training and resource library, a volunteer supporter toolkit, a family resource guide, specific landing page on resources for petitioners, some specific data collection and reporting resources, a county directory where you can go and find links to county-specific county behavioral health and also court websites, and then some FAQs. Go ahead and screen that QR code that you have here on the screen. We also wanted to mention that the talking points and additional context is included in the training materials PDF, including the links that you saw throughout this training. So if you want additional context or information or links to the resources, please feel free to check out those resources along with the training materials of any training in our training library. There are many ways that you can get a hold of us. So in order to receive updates to care, training, and technical assistance materials and other key updates, you can go ahead and join our listserv, visit careact.org, which we just went over. You can also submit a TA request form. There's also a TA request form specific to data. You can also provide general feedback about care, how's it going, and we'll make sure that gets passed along to the appropriate parties. And we also have our email address. We take a no wrong door approach. So if you are not sure where the question should go, or you even need help clarifying what your question is, you can go ahead and email us at info@careact.org, and we can look to connect you with the right person or connect you with the right resources. Thank you.